All right, and it is 4:30 exactly. So I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. Welcome everybody to Giants for the 2022-23 school year. This year we're doing third grade, which is great because we've been trapped in the middle school for the last few years. Not literally, but figuratively. We've been doing sixth grade network, seventh grade network. So it's really nice to come down into the elementary and go through some pretty spectacular units that were designed by some pretty spectacular people. We have one of those people here with us right now. The other will be joining us shortly. So Dr. Gersmehl, I will turn things over to in just a minute. I've just got a few quick housekeeping items. My name is Dave Johnson. I am a social studies consultant for every intermediate school district in Northern Michigan. That's pretty much from Acosta Osceola all the way up to basically everything north of here, but south of whatever I'm doing with this hand is how I like to pronounce it. And before that, I was a middle school teacher in Mesick, Michigan for 10 years, and I've been at the ISD level now for 12 years. So I am in my third and ideally final decade in education here. I am not a third grade teacher, which is why I'm super glad to have Dr. Gersmehl with us and Lyndsey Bensel with us. Lyndsey will be joining us in a little bit. Lyndsey was one of the original authors of the units, and she and Phil will both do a fantastic job with you guys. As far as our norms and stuff like that go, the Vegas rules apply. If you guys during discussion say anything sensitive, I will cut it out of the video recording. So don't worry about that. I am an expert at making Phil look good. You know, between the filters and the sound quality and everything else, you know, feel free. This is a open space, but if anything does come up, I don't imagine it would, but if anything does come up, I promise I will cut it out of the final video. You guys are welcome to have your cameras on or off. That is completely up to you. We recognize you're here on your own time. And some of you may be scarfing down dinner right now, and that is absolutely 100% okay. There may be a couple of times when we're either going to ask you to use the thumbs up reaction, or if your camera's on, show a number of, a number of fingers. But outside of those times, feel free to keep it on or off. I do edit the recordings. They should be up whenever possible the very next day. The only caveat to that is I do have a day job. I'm usually able to work this into that, but occasionally I have presentations scheduled with my own teachers the next day. But the general rule of thumb is within 24 to 48 hours, the video recaps will appear on the website. And then the final housekeeping item I have is that we did apply for sketches. There's going to be a grand total of 11 available for live attendance. So we will keep track with the Zoom logs, and there'll be a sketch form that we'll share with you at a later meeting for you to fill out with just your name and pick number and that sort of stuff on it. So with that, I know that there is some general what is Giants stuff planned for tonight, but the Giants project, for those of you who don't know, began around the time the Michigan Open Book Project left off. One of the big questions that we tended to get from teachers was, hey, we really, really like the open book materials, but where's the teacher kit that goes alongside of it? And so Ottawa Area Intermediate School District took up the mantle and hired some exceptional writers for all the different grade levels, and has built these units from 3rd through 8th grade with some very cool stuff for K2 available now as well. So 6 years later, we've accomplished a lot, and this is the second go around for the 3rd grade networks, but there are some exciting updates that will be part of this as we go through. And like I said, your primary presenters are going to be Dr. Gersmehl and Lyndsey will be joining us shortly. But with that, I will usually chime in at the beginning or at the end, or when Dr. Gersmehl puts me on the spot, which he almost always does at some point throughout the evening. So we'll look forward to my candid responses towards 3rd grade questions at some point tonight, because it will happen. So with that, that's the bulk of the housekeeping stuff that I have for the start of the meeting. Dr. Gersmehl, is there anything I missed, or do you want to just launch right in and get started?
Yeah, and because this is an interactive game, I'm going to ask either that you have quick access to your chat or you turn your video on so that we can, do a count. You need to vote for a place here. So, like I say, I'd appreciate the videos on, but if you would rather go the chat route, we can go the chat route. Part of what this first activity is about, and like Dave said, we have designed one of these activities for every grade level. The activities really have 4 jobs, but job number 1 is, hey kids, social studies can be fun. So it doesn't talk about GLICs, it doesn't talk about standards, it doesn't talk about any of that kind of thing. So with that, I am hoping that punching screen number 1 here. Are you guys now looking at, today we will look at some maps and try to decide. Whoops.
There you go. You are sharing and you're sharing the correct screen.
Yeah, and what I did was I lost all their videos. Any quick idea where that is?
Do you see the Zoom meeting controls?
Oh, there we go.
I
I had to pull the chat off of it.
There you go.
I just had a long Zoom meeting with Minnesota, and they had a weird set of security protocols. And the result of that was that I had to change some settings on my machine, and we haven't gotten them all changed back here. So you should be looking at something that says, hey, today we're going to look at some maps and try to decide where to build a new village to live in. In 4th grade, they build a trading post. In 5th grade, they build a fort. In 6th grade, they locate a capital. In 7th grade, they locate an empire head, and so on. And then each of the grade levels makes the map a little bit more complicated, because job number 2, remember, job number 1 is social studies can be fun. Job number 2 is for you guys to be able to diagnose what they have in their background for map reading skills. It's for you to be able to figure out, who really can read a map right off the bat, and who needs to get it explained to them a little bit. Job number 3 is to have something that absolutely works on that first day, because there's so much other going on in your life then that you just don't want to spend any time thinking about it. And so we try to design something that just flat out works. And my N right now of the number of teachers that have told me that it works is over 800. So I don't know. Out of curiosity, those of you that have your cameras on, have you already played this game with your kids, or are you waiting to see what it looks like and then do it? I saw that. I saw that. Okay. So today we will look at some maps and try to decide where we're going to locate the new village. Our town is going to look something like this one in the picture, because this is a long, long time ago. So there's no cars, no electric lights, no television, and you don't have a cell phone. You do have an old map, and the map shows a lot of empty land to the west of 2 big lakes here. Like most maps, it has a scale line on it to show you how big things really are on this map. So this is 100 miles, this line right here. And it's got a compass point up in the corner there. The PowerPoint goes on to ask, what direction is at the top of the map? Now, I agree. And this is where the PowerPoint that I am showing you is now different. Whenever you see a green box show up, that is just for the workshop here. And that's a little teacher's note. But I need to say right at the beginning, every Giants PowerPoint is too long. And that's a general rule about Giants PowerPoints, because we've sent these out for a lot of review from a lot of teachers. And if any 2 or 3 teachers thought that we ought to add something to it, and they made a lot of suggestions. And unfortunately, nearly all of their suggestions were additions. Like, put a definition card in here, or define north a little bit more clearly, and so on like that. If that suggestion sounded like it would be useful for some teachers, we put it in. And we put it in for a very simple reason. Your computer keyboard has a delete key. It does not have a create key. So it's a whole lot easier for you to take something out that somebody else wanted, but you don't think is as useful than it would be for you to try to create that, like you need a definition card. So you will see a little bit more than you need on every one of these PowerPoints. My advice, if you've never used them before, is to go ahead and use it all the first time, and then you'll know what to get rid of. So back to the PowerPoint. You are coming from the east. You're trying to move farther away from an enemy. Your scouts who went ahead of you have recommended 6 places where you might build your town. And if your teachers, your students need a little bit more review, you might ask a few questions here, like which place is farthest north, or how far is it from place 3 to 2, and so on. If you don't need that, don't do it. So what place would you choose? And I'm not going to have you vote right now, although you probably want to ask your students to do that. And the reason I'm not is it just goes right on to say, asking you to vote after looking at a really simple map shows us a really big problem with voting. And that is you need some knowledge in order to be a smart voter. So what else would you like to know? Some teachers actually choose to stop this right here, make a writing activity about it, and continue it the next day, and let the game play over 4 or 5 days. Other teachers just have the students respond orally. Well, what would you like to know? Still others will just follow the PowerPoint because it goes on to give an example of that. But let me put a teacher note in here. Stop for a minute and show you basically what resources Giants will put available to you. Giants uses a 3-column layout, if you haven't opened it yet. The left column is just a numbering system so that it's easier to find the right part of a different activity of some kind. The middle column is the instructions, and they will usually start out with an inquiry question and an I can statement, because some schools require their teachers to write an I can statement, in their lesson plans and things like that. We'll save you that trouble. We'll mention what GLICs that particular activity is likely to solve, tell you about how long it's going to take. This particular game takes about 40 minutes if you do it all in one day, or you can spread it out over 3 or 4 15, 10-minute sessions. And then the right column are hot links. The PowerPoint that you could use is right there. It's much more convenient for you to download that PowerPoint to your hard drive and run it off your hard drive than to try to run it off here. And the same way for these handout sheets. If you think you want something, just download it off to your drive. Farther down in the middle column on this particular one, it will give you some suggestions for questions that you could ask on slide 2 and slide 6 and slide 13. In other words, it gives you a kind of a study guide for the PowerPoint if you want to use it. Sometimes the resources also include a list of things for you to watch for, particularly this game does, that you should watch for their map skills, their ability to recognize directions, how they talk about weather and location, and so on. And if we do have that kind of thing, give you a little, how many students asked that question, and then what notes do you have? You can kind of take notes to yourself a little bit about how they're doing. There's also a student worksheet that repeats some of the questions that are on the PowerPoint. So if you did want to make a writing activity out of it, and like I say, about a third of the teachers that have used it do want to make an ELA activity out of it, make it a 3-sentence paragraph activity. So back to the PowerPoint. That was the quick view of what Giants looks like. Asking you to vote after looking at a simple map shows us a big problem with voting. This, by the way, is hitting one of your civic splits here too. You need some knowledge to be a voter. So what else do you want to know? You might want to know about the weather. You know, just what's it like in this place? Maybe we can find a map. So here's a bigger map. And it's got some new symbols on it. And whenever you've got a bunch of symbols, you probably should make a map key. So what do you think that symbol represents? And you can go all as Socratic as you want to with your students. Long, cold winter with lots of snow. Did anybody change your mind about where do you want to build your town? Or a long, hot summer with lots of sunshine? Now here comes a kind of a loaded question. Do you think place 3 is colder or hotter than place 4? And this is actually quite an important question for you to ask the students, because the answer will tell you whether they understand that things can happen in between a map symbol that the map symbols can tell you about. You know, that weather can change gradually from a long cold winter to a long hot summer. And I say, in 3rd grade, maybe only a third of the students have already got that idea, you know, safely in their head. So you're busy diagnosing. You're not teaching it, you're just diagnosing. So, what place would you pick for your town? And I think here I'm going to stop and say, either vote with your finger, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I hope you don't have 6 fingers, but you know. Or if you want, write in the chat room, not just what you would vote for, but what do you think your students would vote for? You know, and you'll get a little idea that of the range of answers that people will give, because I can assure you that some students will vote for every one of these places. And then the question, of course, is why? And that becomes another possible writing activity. So put your finger up. Which place do you vote for? I got a couple 5s, a 4, a 3, and a 2. What else do you want to know? Now here is where even more teachers will stop and say, let's talk about this and let's write 3 questions. And then we'll come back tomorrow and we'll see if we can find out the answers to these 3 questions. And these 3 questions will be very illuminating. They will tell you what students think geography is. And some students are only going to think in terms of the physical environment. They're going to ask about hills, about soil, about rivers, and so on. Some are going to think about resources, and they'll ask about copper or cropland. And some are going to think about geopolitics. They're going to ask about enemies and about transportation. So it's really very useful to elicit this from them, either in writing or orally, and find out what they think geography is. And then later on, we can, you know, discuss that a little bit more and get to a common class definition of what geography is about. So we've added a couple more symbols, and it's got, you know, you could have students copy this information onto their desk maps. That gives you yet one more way of looking at how they process a visual image. You know, do they copy it reasonably accurately? Or do they wind up putting things crowded all the way off to the edges and so on? That's a big transition that happens between about age 8 and about 11 in the kind of normal development framework. So asking them to just copy off of the screen onto a map on their desk is a big thing, useful thing to do. And for that reason, we give you a printable map on the desk. So are the hills in place 3 bigger than the ones in place 4? And this is identifying those that can do some visual comparison of the sizes. And which place would you pick for your town now? And did anybody change your vote? Okay, I've added 3 rivers. Did that change anybody's vote? With all the information here, plus your knowledge of temperature, which you should remember from the last map, which place are you going to pick for your town? And you see what we're doing here is we're just giving students not only more different kinds of map symbols, but more different kinds of information. And they really do get into it here. You can have an interesting debate here. And you can even have people stand up and go to different corners of the room and, be the political party in favor of having it place 4 and have them write an advertisement for place 4 or something like that. It'd be the exact same kind of debate that was going on in the Mayflower when the people were coming over from Europe. Where do we want to locate our village? You already know that places 1 to 3 are colder than places 4 to 6. This is important for a lot of reasons. And the map now has some symbols to show the area of good farmland. Has anybody changed your vote yet? Oh, and actually, I would have used this last year when people are talking about the pandemic, because science gives us new information and we wind up having to change our decision on the basis of that new information. In other words, this could be a little mimic model of what was going on back then. So which place do you pick? Again, you have a delete key, so you can take off 2 or 3 of those which place questions and have it be the way you want yours to be scheduled here. So on the last copy of the map, the printer forgot to include 1 short river. And that river connects 2 of the big lakes. Did that change anybody's mind? And again, I'm going to stop it here for just a second. It is based on all of this information here. Where would you choose? And to put that into the chat with the reason that you chose that place. I need to do that because I need to try some Dr. Pepper here. And so within the room here that we've got right now, we've got 4 different places chosen. You will see this happen in your classroom, and they will have good reasons like this. And you want to talk about why one reason might be more important or less important than other reasons. And then with that statement, these maps do show a real place. And you can choose how you want to do the debrief on this. That, you could have them write an ad arguing in favor of their place. You can have a debate. There's all kinds of things you can do in the classroom about this choosing process. And those things will help meet some of the civics clicks that are in the 3rd grade curriculum there too. The Giants curriculum does not have a separate unit about the civics part. We've chosen to mix the civics all the way in through. We've also mixed most of the economic ideas, and we've come up with some economic ideas already today. So We have got a bunch of choices that I've been looking at in this. Do you have an idea where it is? Let me say that there's one last clue. Two of the rivers actually connected to other lakes, but the scouts didn't have that information. And if we take a modern map and put it on top of it, then we've got something that looks roughly like this. And how many of you had guessed that already? Like I say, the third grade one, we've got the map upright. When we get to fourth grade, we tip the map sideways, and in fifth grade, we turn it backwards. We make the map more complicated. And by the time you get to sixth grade, the students have never guessed where it is, but in seventh grade, it's in Egypt and so on like that. But this is a great place for you to stop here. Can you see Michigan on the map? And spend some time just reviewing the names of the lakes and the peninsulas and which one is on the east side and the west side and whatever. The PowerPoint goes on and does this a little bit. It names Michigan. It talks about Lake Superior and Lake Michigan and the Maumee River and so on like that. And then it names the places. And place 5 turns out to be Detroit. And place 2 is Mackinac Island and Mackinac Straits. So the person that was saying that would be a good place to go fishing, that in fact was an Ottawa fishing village that was there at the time. Place 6 is Fort Wayne, which I gather has become a fairly important town in the meantime. Place 4 is a small town up in the hills, familiar to at least one person in the room here. Too far north to grow very successful corn. Too far away from the lakes to have successful trade fishing and so on like that. Place 3 turned out to be important for another reason later on, and that is that the old hills had copper in them. And place 1 just winds up being empty wilderness even now. It's a public land, recreation primarily. And the summary for the activity is very straightforward. People tend to use maps and other information to help them decide where to build houses in towns. And then once they've built that house in town, they're going to use other maps in order to decide where to build particular things within that town. Where do you put the school? Where do you put the sewage treatment plant? Hopefully they're not right next to each other. Where do you put the suburban development? Where do you put the apartments? Where do you put the bank? Other things like that. And if you can put yourself into their place and time, you can often understand why people chose to build their towns where they did. Now, in the chat, and you guys should take a look at the chat, maybe even copy the chat. I don't. Does the chat automatically become part of the recording too?
It's not part of the recording, but it gets saved alongside the video. And I can probably link it.
Like I say, because one of you decided that your village was made up of fisher people, and that in fact is going to come back later on in the curriculum here. So that if you have a student that says, my village will be mostly fishing people, you want to highlight that answer because that person has helped explain why the trade networks that developed among the indigenous peoples were the way they were. That is, there were a group of indigenous people who traded dried fish with other people in order to get other things, particularly meat and nuts and things like that. So you want to remember when they come up with good reasons, because those good reasons wound up being part of the reason why Detroit, Fort Wayne, Cadillac, the Copper Country, Mackinac, why these places wound up the way they wound up and what happened in them historically. So I'm reading good answers in your chat, and it'd be very useful if you had access to those answers. Or another reason, that if none of your students suggest that, you might be the one that has to suggest that. That is, if none of your students mention fishing, which somehow I have a hard time believing in Michigan, me not being a native Michigander, but nevertheless, I suspect there are people in Michigan that don't think very much about fishing. In any case, that is the kickoff game, and you can make it go for as many as 6 or 7 sessions if you link it to other writing and math activities, like measuring the distance between places, or writing down their reasons, or creating an advertisement for a particular town as a preferred location. In other words, you can use this game to kick off a whole lot of other things that you want to be doing in this first couple weeks in order to be diagnosing where your students are. So any other thoughts, Dave, or comments from anybody out in the crowd?
While he's doing that, I just want to quick introduce myself. I'm Lyndsey Bensel, and I've been one of the authors on the Giants Project for the last few years. I came a little late because I was shuffling kids around and trying to get my house quiet for this. But I just want to thank all of you for being here. I know it's hard at the end of a long school day to do a long PD. So I just want to affirm you for coming and thank you for participating with our project.
You guys will get to know Lyndsey pretty well over the course of this school year, but she is awesome. She is absolutely awesome. So glad, so very glad that you are here leading this.
So we didn't know for sure Lyndsey was going to make it here, so we didn't schedule her make it here by this soon. So we didn't schedule her in between. So unfortunately, you get me 2 times back to back. This one is the drink out of the fire hose. This one is kind of the background about the design for Giants, and particularly the design of maps and other visual aids. And we're going to start right off with a wake-up call that was a real class that I was teaching a few years ago. And some real answers to a real test that I gave to this class. The wake-up call is about what I'm going to call the myth of visual learning. And I know that still is a topic of some discussion in some workshops here. So we're going to just take the drink out of the fire hose and see what that leads to. So we'll start out by saying photos or videos are awfully important to teach visual vocabulary. Just the ability to recognize something that you're looking at a particular time. And when I was teaching this class, I was talking about the ecoregions of Africa. Class wasn't a 3rd grade class, but I'm deliberately picking something that's not a 3rd grade topic because we want to focus not on the content here. We want to focus on the principles about using visual aids. So I said, hey kids, this is what a rainforest looks like. It's about here in Africa, close to the equator here. A rainforest is called a rainforest because it's got lots of rain. Rainforest is called a rainforest because it's got big trees in it. People that live in a rainforest tend to build their houses out of wood. They often build their houses up on stilts because a rainforest is hot and rainy, and this helps the place stay a little bit drier. It doesn't have quite so much humidity coming up from the ground, things like that. And then, hey kids, this is what a desert looks like. And the desert is about here in Africa. It doesn't have very much rain. There isn't a tree in sight. So you're going to have to build your house out of something else. Now comes the basic principle. And this is a basic principle that you want to start students realizing as early as 3rd grade. How you live, what you wear, what house you have, what jobs you have, what you do for fun is influenced by where you live. Whether it's a desert, forest, Upper Peninsula, Detroit, so on. So in one sense, and I'm a professional geographer, but I admit it, that geography is the science of the ridiculously obvious. What makes it challenging and what makes it important is that what's obvious in Michigan is not going to be obvious in Mexico, Mongolia, or vice versa. And that's where we are trying to teach students, starting in primary school, how to recognize how other places are different, why other places are different, and why those differences matter. And in a few minutes here, Lyndsey's going to go through a set of lessons that are specifically designed to compare different places within Michigan, Michigan with other places around the United States, and so on, different places within a community. And like I say, my job here is to talk a little bit about the principles that are here. Pictures can help build visual vocabulary, but unless you link that picture with a map of some kind, students aren't going to remember where they are. And the problem is that maps are a lot more abstract than photos. And that leads me to my wake-up call. And the next 5 slides might be the most important slides of this entire set here, because I've already showed you that map a couple times. It was on screen 9 separate times for the students. And then I told them, we're using this map to tell you where the rainforest is, and where the desert is, where the chaparral is, where the savanna is, where the grassland, where the herders are, and so on. At the end of that presentation, I said, this map is in your online textbook. You have to study this map. You've got to study the pattern of environments, because it's really important to understand other things that are going on, you know, from where the camels lived to where the slave trade occurred. Then we went away for a Thanksgiving break. And when we came back from the Thanksgiving break, I handed everybody a blank map and I said, now you've got a simple quiz. Divide this blank map into 3 to 6 regions and write a short phrase to describe each region. So there are some of the answers of the students there. I gave them the outline map of Africa, and they had to divide it into different regions. Now, I know you can't read that, and it's in black and white because that's all they had available. So what I did was I scanned their answer, recolored it to the best of my ability according to the code that was on the original study map. So if the original map had forest in dark green, then if they used the word trees, I would make that dark green. If they called it a forest, I would make it dark green. And the original one had yellow for grassland. If they said cattle, I said that's probably the grassland. It's herding is the grassland. Nomadic tribes might be grassland. So you can see I just recolored it with the code. Now take a look at their answers. Now, you've still got that original map in your short-term memory. It'll probably be there for about another 25 hours or so, and then it'll disappear out of your short-term memory. Just in case it's already gone, that's the original map that they were supposed to study. And isn't it interesting that the Sahara, the biggest and driest desert in the world, became cropland on every one of their maps of Africa? And the rainforest disappeared completely from one map, and it moved all over the continent on the other maps. I call that a wake-up call that human brains just do not store map images accurately. And we have to figure out how to help students learn how to study maps. And one of the big glicks in Giants in 2nd and 3rd grade, because, and this is another neurologic fact, that is when the neural networks in your brain are actually being formed for reading and processing a map image. So that's kind of the heavy message. And then I want to make sure that this sticks in, so we're going to use a bunch of other examples. Because we have to do this in 3rd grade. If they show up in 5th and 6th grade with a mental map of Africa that looks like this, they're going to have a hard time understanding malaria or the spread of Islam or colonization or the slave trade or Boko Haram, terrorism, refugees, or any of the other ways in which Africa shows up in the news these days. So what can we do to K3 to help students learn how to learn from maps? That's our loaded question. And what we do is got to be able to convince the school principal, who's terrified of standardized tests, that this is just as important as a reading or math activity. And so that's part of what the philosophy behind Giants is to teach the math skills in a way that also supports reading and math, but it builds a solid foundation for what they need to do. So with that in mind, I'm going to go to part 2 of this, which is a little game that we're just going to play in the workshop here. And the game is called Where's the Treasure? It's based on a game that they actually do in Giants 2nd grade, where we hide a treasure in the playground, and in 1st grade, where we hide a treasure in the classroom. If your students didn't do Giants in 1st and 2nd grade, you might want to think about looking at the treasure map activity in those grades and doing it in 3rd grade, just to make sure that they've got some of this background information about how to process a map. So the philosophy statement is to understand how children see a map. It really helps to learn how human brains encode spatial information. The spoiler alert is we do it in a bunch of different ways. So if you haven't seen this before, and no cheating here, Lindsay. If you haven't seen this before, we're going to have you vote on where a treasure is hidden. The treasure is on this very simple map. It's got 9 identical books, and they're located on 9 identical classroom tables, except each table is identified by a different color construction paper on it. So we've got 9 books on 9 tables. There's the door to the room down here. And there's a treasure. I'm going to hide a $50 bill underneath that book. Since this is the teacher workshop and it's virtual, it's going to be a virtual $50 bill that I'm hiding underneath there. And this is you. So you're standing here, you're looking over these 9 tables, and you know there's a $50 bill hiding underneath this one. And the question is, how are you going to remember where that treasure is? Let me give you about 30 seconds to write into the chat room. What code are you going to use to remember where that treasure is?
For the sake of the recap as well, there's some great stuff popping up in the chat, like color code, color of paper, and location of the book in case the colors disappear. The treasure is on the orange colored table closest to the circle table, front and center. I like that directness there, Helen. That's awesome. Orange table with the book in the bottom center.
Okay. And I like that. It's going to save me the slide that I took out of this PowerPoint, because I kind of thought that this is what you would come up with. Like I say, I've run this with, I don't know, when did you hear it first, Dave?
Maybe 2015. I've delivered it at least as many times as you have since then.
Yep, that would be about right. So between us, we probably have what, 900, 1,000 people who've done this?
At least.
And they come up with the same answers because, in fact, your brain is pre-wired to do particular kinds of spatial reasoning. So how are you going to remember where the treasure is? And then I put up in the PowerPoint that's online, I put up a list of all of those possibilities: the orange table, the front middle of the room, the bottom of the table, the right position on the table, it's, the one that's closest to my right hand, of the things like that. I've now taken you into another room. The door is over here. It has 9 tables, but they aren't in exactly the same place. The treasure, however, is in the same place. So in these previous classes that I've run, teachers have suggested 6 different places where the treasure might be. And depending upon how old the teachers are, depending upon whether they were math majors or not, depending upon whether they were very young children or not, they tend to privilege different ones of these. So let's do a quick vote. If you got your screens up where I can actually look at your screen, just put the number up on, where did they do? Table 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If not, you could write in the chat room there. We can see the range that we've got. So table 5, table 2. Yeah, Dave, you've seen this before. Thanks a lot, Dave. So back to the PowerPoint to take a look at this. And in less than 5 minutes, I'm going to take you onto a real map where we're going to use exactly these same codes. So this is not a completely abstract activity, but the question is extremely simple. What table has the treasure? And the answer is not at all simple. It depends on how your brain happens to be doing spatial thinking at the time. And like I say, there is a definite male-female difference. It is significant enough that about 24 psychologists have analyzed it, and they have decided that certain kinds of test questions are not fair to use in engineering schools. That research was done up at Northern Michigan University, I'm sorry, at Houghton, Michigan Tech. But there are a lot of psychologists that have looked at the way in which human brains process this kind of geographic information, even on an extremely simple map like this. In your classes in 3rd grade, you are likely to get a very significant minority, perhaps even a majority. We'll say it's on table 1. It's the one closest to my right hand, because that tends to be the network that is most often privileged by young children. So often privileged by young children that Piaget actually thought that was the only one that young children had, was an egocentric framework that you would use your right hand, and that you didn't learn a more coordinate-oriented framework until about age 9 or 10. We now know that Piaget had the stages correct, but he had the ages wrong, and that in fact, people begin to develop that 2nd and 3rd network as early as age 4 and 5. In other words, they do it in preschool. But as late as third grade, you will still see a substantial number of people that will vote for the proximity network. If you chose table 2, it's on the orange colored table, which a couple of you had chosen in the first one, and then one voted for in what I looked at real quickly in the chat room here. Color association is probably the most common among another subgroup of the population. I'm going to leave it open question for right now as to what group that is, and we can raise that later on in the question and answer period. Because more of you chose table number 3, the middle of the front row. And the sequence network is, again, a separate brain network. In fact, if I had a quick model of a skull handy here, I'll use my own for that example. Network number 1 is in the back right-hand side of your head. Network number 2 is in front of your right ear. Network number 3 is above your left eyebrow. Network number 4, which is the analogous position network, the front middle of the table, that's right up on the top of your head. In other words, these are very separate modules within your head that are all processing this geographic information. The one that you happen to access depends often on what question you were asked, how that question was phrased. In other words, as a teacher, when you're talking to students about a map, the words that you use often will trigger them to move from one network to another. And then there are the more complicated networks. The middle row on the right, on the door side of the room. Now that's a network you're not going to see very often in third grade, but it comes very common about 7th or 8th grade. And then the one that drives people who are designing tests, and if Scott Koenig is still listening on this is pretty important for our assessment design, is that this is a perfectly plausible place, the one that Dave had mentioned. If you remember, on the first map, the treasure was hidden under the book that was in the bottom middle of the table that is in the bottom middle of the map of the room. And now, in this room, it is in the upper right-hand corner of the table that is in the upper right-hand corner of the room. And this is the kind of one that out of maybe 800-900 students, teachers usually, in workshops in about 15 different states, I've given this particular game in live workshops like that. And I've only had a very small handful of people that have come up with this the first time around. It is the kind of answer that often comes up where somebody thinks of a right answer that never occurred to the person who was designing the test. And it's one of the reasons why standardized tests, the students who tend to do the best on the standardized tests are actually the A and the A- students or B+ students, that often your very top students, your most creative students in the class, and then a handful of them that are just plain lucky guessers will often do better on the standardized question that is a sophisticated one like this. Now, I'm saying this partly to reinforce the notion. The human brain has, I think, either 8 or 9 separate networks. I've got about 4,000 research studies in a bibliography to back up that statement. We have an association network, we have a proximity network, we have a comparison network that Lyndsey's going to be talking about a little bit later on. We've got a sequence network, we've got an analogy network, and then we've got some cross-link networks that are even more complicated. Now, this is not a lecture on the neuroscience of the human brain. This is a lecture on why students often will see different things when they look at a map. The bottom line for teachers is just to realize that human brains have multiple networks to process spatial information. They work in parallel at roughly the same time and not always consciously. A key article for this was done in 2004. Talked about different brain areas for different judgments about location. And that was followed, like I said, with hundreds of other articles. Different brain areas, multiple systems, independent processing, parallel processing, and the magic word for educators, individual differences. The joke, of course, is if human brains were simple enough for us to understand them, we might be so simple we couldn't. Now, this is not about learning styles. That's a whole different presentation, and we can talk about that later. It is about the visual system and the brain networks that humans use to read maps and graphs and text and numbers and anything else that comes in visually. Let me pull out one short quotation. It comes from Stan DeHaan, the director of the largest reading and math neuroscience lab in the world, and a book that he wrote called Reading in the Brain. It's one of my all-time favorite books. And he said, visual spatial attention is of paramount importance in the normal development of reading. Good decoding skills do not come from association between shape and sound alone. Letters also must be seen in the right orientation, the right spatial location, the right left-right order. In other words, we've got to use all of those separate brain networks in order to read a word. And to understand that in mathematics, 4 is between 5 and 3, you know. Giants map activities are based in this research. They're designed to reinforce the visual spatial skills that students also need to learn how to read. That research helps explain different kinds of dyslexia, why we don't no longer talk about a single kind of dyslexia. There's a sequence dyslexia, there's an orientation dyslexia, there's proximity dyslexia. So what can we do in K3 to help students develop these networks? So I'm going to show you what we're going to do in K2, because if they didn't do it in K2, you need to be able to diagnose it. In K2, we make it a camel map reading. We read a story about camels with your students. Our New York kids just love camels because it's the first thing you see in the Bronx Zoo. And there are a lot of good books about camels that you can use in a read-along like this. Dan encouraged the children to do some kind of spatial thinking. Don't just point to a complex map and say they live here, because the evidence is clear. Children just don't learn much geography from this map. If you look at this grain symbol, how's a child going to encode where it is? It's near the gorilla. That's table 1. It's associated with a light green color. That's table 2, the orange table. It's between the camel and the oil well. That's table 3, middle of the front row. It's in northern Nigeria. That's table 4, the analogic position. In other words, when children look at a complicated map, they use the same parallel brain networks. And a really complicated map, they won't remember because they're using different networks. So it does not promote visual durable memories. If it did, my kids wouldn't have screwed up my Africa map. Like I say, this is not learning styles. Learning styles, the contrast between the enormous popularity of learning styles within education and the complete lack of credible evidence for its utility in psychology is striking and disturbing. That's a summary from the American Psychology Association. So we suggest you use very simple maps, and that's what we design in Giants. This is the 2nd grade map to have the children apply a specific skill, color the camel region. You kids just made a regional map of Africa. Africa's big, it's far away, but you kids are smart. You can say something about Africa just by looking at this map. And then in second grade, we want them to ask a specific question. Do camels like to live in the north part of Africa or the south part? Because if they would have learned that, well, first of all, they need to do some scaffold. They need to know what north and south is, and Giants does that. These are basically vocabulary lessons focusing on prepositions. But if they learn where camels live in second grade, they're going to know where the deserts are in sixth grade. They're going to know where Islam is when they get to world history in seventh grade. It's all part of a Giants K-8 sequence of activities that we've designed. In my session after the break, we're going to talk about the Michigan map and the Africa map. Let me just end this with saying different children will encode information from a map in different ways. With proper guidance, every child can learn how to do all of it better. They don't just get information from the map, they have to learn how to learn from maps. And they should do that with a map that matters. In Africa, the map that matters was about camels. In fourth grade, the map was about pine trees. And in third grade, the map is, well, I'll show you what it is in third grade a little bit later on. So this will now go on to describe some Giants activities that feature comparison. They are built on this kind of research. Lyndsey and Joy and I talked about it at some length here. And I will either stop sharing if Lyndsey, you want to start sharing yours, or else I've got your slides on here. Up to you.
Awesome. Okay. I can't see anyone's faces, so I'm just going to talk and I'm going to assume that you're there. So the Giants curriculum has 4 units for third grade, and each unit is really organized around a compelling question. And the compelling questions are big questions that we want our students to wrestle with and that we ourselves might have to wrestle with too. So before I go into my part, I thought we could just take a second to try to answer this question: what makes Michigan special? And if you grew up in Michigan and have lived here for a long time, you might have some different answers than other people. So we can just do, you can turn your microphone on or we can drop it in the chat. But what do you think makes Michigan special? Okay, so someone said 4 seasons, which you might experience in one day, like today. Great Lake. Any other ideas? So
The shape, it's a
landforms.
mitten.
A mitten, yeah.
Okay, I'll give the New York perspective. The most interesting state in flyover country from a political perspective.
And you can definitely see it in flyover country too, right? All right, so the first unit, as I said, is really organized around this big question: what makes Michigan special? And supporting questions, and they're all around conditions. So students are going to investigate how are conditions in Michigan similar to or different from other states, which is that comparison. And then they're going to think about how conditions are different in different places in Michigan, which is really unique to our state. And then we'll have students kind of think about Michigan's location in North America. So I want to start by saying that when you're considering different conditions, you might take some time to really root your students in your own community. So this is a picture. We have this really awesome set of dunes behind our school, and we usually will use it in the spring and the fall to hike. And we have a really cool geographic location. So we really start this unit off by just talking about our own community, whether that's in our school neighborhood or outside of that. So you might do the same, just really getting your students to think about what's the condition in my community. And that kind of builds off the work that students do in K2 social studies as well. So once you do that, you'll kind of encounter our first read aloud connection. So we really worked hard to kind of weave in some math and math, reading, and writing throughout the curriculum. So this is one of the texts that you'll use in the first unit to really get students thinking about your big compelling question. So this book is M is for Mitten, and it's a really cute book that students like to look through on their own, even outside of your social studies time. So I would 100% recommend buying it. And this is one of the texts that comes with a reading guide. So you can use it, you can use your own teacher judgment to read through it. You can use the lesson notes to support you, or there's also this more comprehensive reading guide. So then once you start thinking about different conditions around Michigan, you're also going to think about how Michigan compares to other states. So in the unit, there's this graphing activity where students are really going to be comparing temperature in different states to the temperature in Michigan. And we know that some states have really similar temperature graphs where they kind of have a warm summer, really cold winter, warm spring. And then other states are going to be a little bit different. So that kind of speaks to that comparison work that Phil was talking about earlier. And this brings in the map connection, because we know in third grade, our students are kind of asked to do lots of different kinds of graphing. So this will kind of tie into the graphing work you'll do in your math work. As you're kind of moving through how Michigan compares to other states, you're going to think about comparing Michigan, which is a peninsula state, to another peninsula state. And we picked Florida because some students have some experience with Florida. It's a popular spring break destination. Grandparents live there in the wintertime. And it also has a lot of things that are in common with Michigan. So you'll use the similar text, S is for sunshine, to kind of go through and compare how is Michigan the same and different from Florida. And it's really going to help you highlight how the weather impacts a lot of things across the state, how geography impacts a lot of things across the state. And I had seen in the text or chat that someone had mentioned landforms. So you might talk a little bit about that there too. And again, there's a reading guide that goes along with this text. So after you think about how Michigan compares to different states, you'll really think about how the communities in Michigan are also really different and diverse. So this is a snowfall graph, which is another graphing activity you'll do to bring in that math connection. And this one, you'll make a pictograph. But one thing to be aware of is that if your students aren't ready for a pictograph, or if you thought that maybe they could use some more bar graph work, you can always use the resources from earlier in the unit and just kind of repeat the same graphing activity with a different data set. So this is one option that you might use, or you might continue to do the vertical bar graphing. And then there's also a map activity, which is going to really build a connection with students, because we know that lake effect snow is real, and we know that it affects our state differently in different places. My sister lives on the east side of the state, and so I often complain to her because we get a lot more snow than she does. Oh, that was really fast. So what questions might you have? What questions might you have about that first chunk, comparing different parts of Michigan and Michigan to other places?
One thing I think it's safe to point out is that a lot of libraries have MS for Mitten. So if you, I know budgets are tight and you guys have already started the school year, but you needed a copy of it, I'm sure either your local library or through interlibrary loan, they can probably get a copy in your hands for when you need it.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for pointing that out, Dave. I also want to mention too that Unit 1 is really nice to bring in some things that make your community special. It is a longer unit, but there's lots of opportunities for you to highlight some things that are really interesting and unique in your own community, and that there are some other texts that you can read in there to highlight what makes Michigan special.
This again, I'm going to just use the PowerPoint that's in the Giants package, add a few green teacher notes to it, and we're going to spend about a third of this session looking at this PowerPoint, and then we're going to go out to the clickable maps and talk about some of the map activities that are available there. So we're down into the middle of the opening workshop, so this is where we start talking about things like clicks and so on. And the making a region map one nails one GLIC exactly. GLIC 3G201 says we're supposed to talk about how Michigan can be divided into regions. Then we've got 202 describing the regions to which Michigan belongs. And here I'm just going to say I put that in indented and in blue because there's a little bit of a problem with that GLIC. And it has to do with the way some textbooks tend to misuse the idea of region. So we'll come back to that a little later on. Then there are GLICs 101 and 102 about thematic maps to describe the physical and human characteristics of Michigan, which you basically have to do in order to use visual materials to divide Michigan into regions. So this activity has to deal with both of those GLICs. We've also got cardinal directions, scale, and key, which may still be a little bit puzzling for some students. And we don't want to go too far into region doing, making region maps until we make sure that they've got those skills under their belt. And then finally, there are the GLICs 305, 306, and 401. And those are the ones about how different groups of people adapted to and used and modified their environment. And we should do our region map in a way that supports those GLICs later on. There's a tendency, again, in some published curricula, some online curricula, to do the skill of making a region map with a, quote, fun map. You know, we'll make a region map of UFO sightings, you know, or zombies or something like that. And the problem is when you're done with that, you have put into your brain one of the maps that is going to stick around for the longest time because you've spent time working with it, and yet it doesn't help you at all. So we're going to go to these GLICs here and say we're going to use those GLICs in order to choose what maps we're going to make the region activity out of. So with that, this is the basic map of Michigan. And if you can see my face off in the corner of your screen, we actually have versions of this map available in all sizes. Later on, Lindsay's actually going to show you a picture of her class wrapped around a 10-foot by 10-foot floor map version of this and talk a little bit about some floor map activities that we have. And we can also make these. The one that I'm holding up here is about 18 inches square, and it costs about $6 to make it in a way that'll last nearly forever. And you might want to have them find the compass rose to make sure that they've got the notion of direction down. Maybe even label the edges of the map, northeast, south, and west. Label the upper peninsula, the northern one, and the lower peninsula. Teacher note is whenever you're talking about a map like this, it is very helpful to deliberately elicit a verbal restatement of what they see on the map. That's what makes the map memorable. In other words, they don't remember that the Sahara Desert was in the north part of Africa by looking at that image there. They remember it by looking at the image and then saying, oh, yes, the desert is in the north part of Africa. So it is that link between the visual image and the verbal restatement of it that actually makes that map stick around in their heads. So you want to elicit a statement like the upper peninsula is northern Michigan and the lower peninsula is the southern part of Michigan. Then it helps to label the lakes that you've got. And we deliberately make the names of various things a separate layer on these clickable maps so that you can turn them off and make a quiz out of them at any time. Like, what's the lake that is to the west of the lower peninsula? And there's a stack of these questions available on the center part of the Giants instruction guide. so that you could go through and say, you know, just how you describe where Lake Erie is. It's south and east of the Lower Peninsula. Now, teacher note, you can, of course, delete all of those frames from this PowerPoint. If your students are already comfortable with the names of the peninsulas and lakes, you've done Emmys for Mitten a couple times, you've had them work with a map on the floor or on their desk, you don't need this in this PowerPoint. So, like I say with the PowerPoints, if a teacher thought they might want to use it, we put it into the PowerPoint because it's easier for you to delete it out than it is to add it later. So back to the PowerPoint, we're going to learn how to study a map that shows the locations of individual observations, and then to use that information to make a region map. You saw that happen already with the camel map in the second grade curriculum, but if they didn't do that camel map, then you're going to have to spend a little more time with this in your third grade curriculum. So you're going to have to actually define what a region is. A region is, a definition card says it's a group of places that are similar to each other and fairly close to each other. That sounds straightforward and simple, but as you can see, it's going to get a little bit complicated. Why do we make region maps? Is because when we remember where the group of things are, we don't have to remember each individual one anymore. We just remember what the Great Lakes states are. Now, here comes the problem. And here's another 5 slides that you're going to not have in the version that's on the Giants website. This is just a teacher note to you. Some textbooks, a lot of websites, and even some assessments are a little bit confused about the idea of a region. For example, here is a truly terrible question that I took straight out of the New York Regents exam. They asked, what region is West Virginia part of? And the reason I say it's a terrible question is that they wanted the answer to be it's in the Mid-Atlantic region, because that's what one textbook said. But go out sometime and, well, no, I'll do it for you. I will Google Mid-Atlantic region. And this is what you get from different images of the Mid-Atlantic region. And if you just count states, the Mid-Atlantic region has 3 states, or 4 states, or 5 states, or 6 states, or 7 states, or 8 states. And if I were to scroll down a little bit further, there's actually one that has 11 states in the Mid-Atlantic region. And yet, the 5th grade GLICs do talk about dividing the colonies into the 3 regions, New England, Mid-Atlantic, and the South, as if everybody had the same definition of Mid-Atlantic. Like I say, it's a kind of a terrible test question. It's a whole lot better to be asking questions in different ways, because in fact, New York isn't even part of the Mid-Atlantic according to this person here, which is the US, well, no, I made a little teacher note. The US government actually has more than 30 different maps of the regions of the US. And there's a good reason for this. That is, the regions that you would have for agriculture are inevitably going to be different than the regions for landforms, or for wildlife, or for immigration, or for poverty, or for education. And so the CDC has got a different region for their cancer map, and the Department of Energy has got a different regions. So regions is something that's constructed. And that's the main message that you want to try to give to the students in 3rd grade, that people make region maps. They weren't just handed down to us in Mount Sinai, you know, engraved in stone. And we choose to do that. The first activity about the region map, the PowerPoint that I'm showing you, is a region called the nut tree region. And nut trees are like camels in Africa. If you know where the nut trees are, you've got a really good clue about a whole lot of other topics. I could just about use that nut tree region to predict the vaccination rates for COVID. There's a no, that's a long and involved causal pathway, but it's a real one. The political regions and economic regions are built on resource regions, and nut trees turned out to be a really important resource. Now, we can talk about that a little bit later on when we look at the clickable maps. For right now, the way we make a region map is that people go out and they make observations. And if a forest had a lot of nut trees, they would draw a little acorn at that particular location. And when you did that for enough observations, you get a map like that. So step one is to take your map of observations and to draw a line around the group of places that are similar to each other and close to each other. And it's pretty easy with the nuts, you know, they're all kind of in the same part of the state. Next step is to color the area inside that line in order to make it a little bit easier to see. Then you ought to make a symbol key for your map here. So the key says this is the nut tree region of Michigan. And then, like I said, the important fourth step after the map is made is to describe that location in words. In other words, to write out the nut forest region of the state of Michigan is in the southern part of the Lower Peninsula. If you want to get a little bit more sophisticated, it's in the southern part of the Lower Peninsula, but not too close to the lakes. Now, the definition is simple: a group of places that are similar to each other and fairly close to each other. The My Open Book. The direct link to the My Open Book will take you right to the page that talks about the nut tree or the regions of Michigan. Then, like I said, this PowerPoint is in here, and you can click on it and download the PowerPoint, and you can run the PowerPoint if you want to, or you can make an activity out of it with the Pine Region Map activity. And then there's a few others that you can use either for reinforcement or for assessment later on. So the Pine Region of Michigan activity looks like that. And it basically asks the students down at the bottom to draw a line around the pine regions. The places with pine tree symbols are close to each other. And then you can color that area and say that's the pine region. Now, why do we have them do a pine region map first? Well, there's a tiny little fact that the pine trees of Michigan were worth almost twice as much as all of the gold in California in the entire history of the state of California. And yet the gold rush was a pretty important part of American history, just like the Pine Region of Michigan was a pretty important part of American history. And this becomes a really big part of the fourth grade curriculum when they talk about the economies of Michigan after statehood. It also is a part of the third grade curriculum because this would go a long way toward influencing what kind of lifestyle the indigenous people would have had before Europeans showed up. So you can run this as a print activity, as an individual project, as a take-home activity, as a group project. You can make it a watch-along for the rest of this PowerPoint, or you could use a map like this as an assessment later on. We just tried to provide you with about a dozen of these maps for different topics that are important in the geography and history of Michigan. So back to the PowerPoint. In the real world, you often have to look pretty carefully and make decisions about what is a group of close together places that are like each other. For example, if you look at this map of pine forest, does it have 1, 2, 3, 4? How many regions does it have? I mean, you could say Michigan has 5 main pine regions and a few smaller bunches of pine trees scattered around the state. In fact, people from the area just south of Holland, down near Hamilton, probably want to make a separate pine region here because, in fact, there's a whole lot of pine trees in one little area of kind of sandy soil right down there. And once you've got pine trees on sandy soil, you pretty well don't have cornfields or any of the other things that went along with cornfields as part of the economy of Michigan. In other words, that's a little outlier region that is not typical of the regions in Michigan, and yet it's important in that local place. If you don't happen to live in Holland or Grand Haven or someplace like that, then you might want to deal with these bigger ones. In fact, you might want to just say the Upper Peninsula has two long, skinny pine regions, and the Lower Peninsula has just one kind of great big one here with a little hole in the middle of it. Just like the map of camels had a little hole in the middle of the desert. What you want the kids to realize is that making a region is a judgment call. They have to realize that every time they see a region map, whether it's a map of religions in 7th grade, whether it's a map of deserts in 6th grade, somebody had to make a decision about categories, about criteria, about where to draw the lines. And that most times that's a simple decision. It's based on just making a lot of observations and drawing a line around the area. A group of places that are like each other and fairly close. It does take a little bit of time and practice. And then when we look at the clickable maps a little bit later on, Lyndsey can tell you, how many times you have to go through this for some students for them to get the idea. But when you do this and you verbalize it, you can remember that map a whole lot better. So this is the direct link to the website. I didn't necessarily trust that we would be able to make a direct jump to it here. And so I added a couple of the frames here. On this, I have taken the clickable map that we're going to look at. And what I've done is I've turned on the village key and the Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi villages. So you can actually see there's a kind of an Ottawa region here, the blue squares. And there's a separate Potawatomi region in the southern part of Michigan and the western or the eastern part of Wisconsin. Ojibwe was actually two different groups of people that had two very different approaches to the Europeans when they came, to the resources that they were using, and so on. The textbooks all talk about the 3 fires, but in fact, there were 4 or 5 separate groups, one of which has disappeared completely. And we really should think in terms of 2 different types of Ojibwe. That being the case, we're going to wait until the next session, sometime in late October, November, to talk a little bit more about the indigenous people. When we go to this clickable map, we're going to start talking about some of the resource regions of Michigan. Not just the nut tree region, but the porcupine region and the birch bark region and so on. There is a document in the resources over here. When you click on that, you can just download it. It's a Word document that has a description of each one of those maps. So it gives you the background information that you need to talk about that map with your students. That if you haven't, read of geography of Michigan lately, this will kind of fill out some of your background information. So with that, I'm going to click on this and hope that I wind up going directly to a clickable map. On my screen, I did. And the question is, are we on that on your screen?
You sure did. And for those who didn't see it in the chat, you'll find all of this in the Giants unit, and that clickable map is also linked in the lessons at the appropriate place. And now back over to Phil to show us how it works.
Well, now we're just going to you and Lyndsey, and we're just going to talk about this thing. So there is a math activity in here. If you want to do the location grid, you can turn it on. And what it's got is it's divided the entire map into squares that are 40 miles on a side. And we picked 40 miles for a very simple reason, that you can divide it into 20-mile sub-squares, and then you can divide those into 10-mile squares if you want to. But you could start out by saying, what big city is in coordinates K11. And then you can ask them, okay, let's find our town on this map, and let's figure out what our coordinates are. So we can talk a little bit about the coordinate system that I think it was Kevin mentioned this way back when we were playing the game, that you want to get them to where they realize this is a very useful tool to help them talk about it. That when we put up the copper ore, which I can do fairly easily here, we can talk about what coordinates are the copper ore located in. That this map is set up so that you can turn on or off any one of these layers. And there's a whole lot of topics here. So let me flip this over to Lyndsey. What would you have them click on first in order to kind of do some exploring of this? What do you use?
So I'm going to turn my video off while I'm talking just to help with the audio. I apologize for my internet. So I've done this a couple ways. One year I kind of introduced one layer at a time, and we just started with the rivers. And then because most kids have kind of some background knowledge with a river, and then we would add in some things that they would also be familiar with. So pine trees, maybe fishing. And then other years, I have just given my kids, so in our district in Grand Haven, we have one-to-one devices. So I've just given my kids the link to this website, and I didn't really give them any direction other than what do you notice? And I just kind of let them play around with the links just to see what's on there, how does it work? There's always one kid or maybe two who just wants to click on every layer. And so I let them. And then we kind of use it. We kind of talk about the features of the map after they've had that sandbox time. And then another thing I wanted to add, Phil, about the maps is that there are a ton of printable maps in units 1 and 2. And one year, one success I had was having my students create a social studies notebook. And whenever we did a map, we would glue that in there so that they could have that for later to reference, especially once we did all that regional work and we were highlighting and circling regions. So that's just another tip that you might use.
Like you said, in the resources, there are JPEG copies of all of these maps. And some of them are attached to questions about them, like that pine tree activity, so that you could hand it out and they get the map of where the Ottawa villages were. And then there's some questions at the bottom about what resources might they have available, ways that you can use that map. I mentioned that if you know where the map of nut trees are, you know a lot of other things about Michigan. Nut trees turns out to be a pretty good predictor of the population of Michigan. That population density tends to be very high in the areas that had nut trees back at the time. And if they didn't grow nut trees, the population density tends to be somewhat lower. It's a major difference in the resource availability for a whole lot of economic activities. So nut trees became a useful one here. It turns out that nuts were one of the most important trade goods for the indigenous people that were here in the old days. And the student might wonder exactly why that would be until you think about it for a little while. If you're going hiking in the wilderness, you're going out to Yosemite, or Yellowstone National Park and going hiking, the odds are you're going to put something like nuts or a granola that's got a lot of nuts in it in your pack, because it is one of the most portable, durable, non-perishable, and high calorie, and therefore high value sources of food that you can carry. And that made it a very important trade good because you couldn't grow it everywhere in Michigan. And people would take the nuts from the southern part of Michigan and then go up to where birch trees would grow, and they would trade nuts for birch bark so that they could make a canoe. Now, I'm getting way ahead of ourselves here. These are lessons that are in Unit 2 and Unit 3 about trade within various indigenous people and then trade between those different people and the Europeans that came along and what furs those people wanted. Now, we don't have a map of beavers because, in fact, beavers grew everywhere in the state of Michigan. So that part of the fur trade, it just doesn't make any sense to make a map of it. But we say that in the notes there, that we've made maps of things that actually are different from one place to another. So any other thoughts as to where you would go next? I've got a couple ideas about what I would show, but Dave, you got a thought, or Lyndsey?
So one thing I like to use the clickable for is just to make sure that every time when we're talking about a concept that we reference the map, and there's so many layers on here that you can really make sure that there's a layer that matches the concept that you're talking about. I like to use it a lot in Unit 2, especially when we talk a lot about resources. But again, getting the students to use it so that they can use it as a reference on their own I found to be really helpful.
And I like up in my zone bringing up the red, the population dots, the population density, the population numbers, because my zone up north isn't very big. Our biggest town, our biggest city is Traverse City, which is like Holland size maybe, which is not big at all when you compare it to a Grand Rapids and a Detroit. So showing kids that, hey, you think we've got a lot of people up here, take a look at the southern half of the lower peninsula, and where do you see the most dots clustered, and where do you think those places are?
And it does show population in 3 different ways. There's a weird little map called population numbers. These are just basically kind of the percent of Michigan's population that's in different counties. And so 18% of Michigan's population is in Wayne County over here. 6% is over here in Grand Rapids. And then, like Dave said, you've got to drive a long ways to get 1% of the population of the state up here. Now, you guys probably already know, but your students might not know. And that was one of the reasons why we did the thermometer graphs that Lyndsey was talking about earlier, the thermometer graph activity, that the growing season is long enough to grow corn and nut trees down here, and then it drops off very rapidly just about here at the Saginaw latitude. And when the growing season drops off, the number of available resources drops off. And when that happens, the human population drops off. Now, if this map were made in the summertime, when people are up visiting their lake houses, it might look a little bit different. But that's not when the Census Bureau takes its census of the population. So growing season turns out to be a really important division within the state of Michigan, dividing the upper part of the lower peninsula from the lower part. And that showed up with the nut trees here. And it shows up even more dramatically when we go over and try to find, cornfields or something like that. Now, when your map starts to get cluttered like this, which I did kind of deliberately, and it gets hard, there is a clear map button over here, and then you can just put the nut trees on and say, it turns out that Morse's Gazetteer, which was the book that people read in New York when they came into the United States, they would buy a copy of Morse's Gazetteer, and it said, if you are moving to the frontier, you want to pick land that has nut trees growing on it, because if it grows nut trees, it will also grow corn. And you can therefore have a farm in that place. But if that land does not have nut trees on it, then you're either going to have irrigation systems in order to grow corn, like on the sandy soils over here near Holland, or you're not going to grow corn. That was actually, the book is called The Emigrant's Guide to the Frontier. And people would buy this book in New York in 1820, and then they would get on the Erie Canal or the wagons that would move out there. They would move to Michigan, and they would go deliberately try to find some land that had some nut trees. So when we had students make a region map of nut trees at the beginning, it was because it predicted where you could grow corn, not just where you could grow corn, but if I make this just corn over here, it turns out that if I turn on my 3 tribes over here, corn was one of the things that the Potawatomi people would trade for things like birch bark or for fish, because the fishing map, and I'll make this simpler, the fishing map shows that fishing was a whole lot better along the shorelines up in the northern part of the state than in the southern part. Because the water is colder up there, colder water holds more oxygen. That's the kind of fact that is in the handout sheet that we put into the resource list. It'll tell you things like colder water holds more oxygen. So if you're like me, where you grew up along the Maumee River, which is a polluted sewer, you just never got into fishing as a kid. I had to kind of learn what made good fishing when I came to Michigan, so I could at least carry on a little bit of a conversation. Because the whole Isaac Walton thing is lost on me. I grew up in a place where fishing was not part of our lifestyle. Now, of course, the Maumee River's been cleaned up and they actually have some good fish in it. Yeah, how times do change over time. Any other thoughts as to how we use clickable maps like this? I think I'd turn down the heavy snow one real quickly like that. This is a great one just to talk about lake effect snow, like Lyndsey was talking about a little bit earlier, and why it occurs in particular places. It's also a good example of how people can process the same map image through different networks. Some people will see this as a proximity thing. Lake effect snow is near the lakes. Others will say there's a region of lake effect snow on the west side of the Lower Peninsula. And they're using the region idea and the analogy network in their brain. In other words, the language they will use to remember where lake effect snow is can be different from one person to another, because they're actually using different brain networks to look at that map. And we want to teach them how to do all of it. So we want to be careful not to use the language that works best for us all the time, because some students are going to prefer to use a different language for that. Now, we hide a lot of that under the hood in Giants, but it is based in that kind of research, and that we deliberately designed these activities and the way the questions are asked. So heavy snow turns out to be an important thing. I don't know how many people realize, but we actually had an important coal region in Michigan for a while. It's one of the reasons why we had shipbuilding and things like that going on in Saginaw and places like that. And we now have a really important gas region up here in the northern part of the state. There's the USDA map about shaded relief. It kind of gives you a little picture of what the hills look like. When we get to the end of, by units 3 and 4, where we start talking about treaties, the clickable maps have got treaties and the treaty numbers keyed to a printed activity. So I think I just about clicked on most every one of these. One activity that one teacher from Traverse City liked to do was to turn the tributaries on, the rivers that flow into other rivers, and have the students outline the watersheds of different rivers, because that turned out to be important in the lesson that they were doing about pollution. PFAS is showing up because of this river over here. So we'd make that separate. And we were very careful to have the key for the indigenous groups clickable off, so that you can make a quiz out of this, like which group of indigenous people is represented by these blue squares, and you make that a little quiz for the assessment later on. Uh, like I say, there are JPEG versions of most of these in the resource packet. If you don't happen to see a JPEG of what you want, just make your own, do a screen capture, clip it away, and use that to make your assessment or your activity that you want to use.
Phil, can I add one thing?
Yeah, absolutely.
So another way I've used the clickable maps is at the end of the unit, you're going to introduce Google Maps to your students just to think about Michigan within North America. And one thing that students actually figured out is they can turn on that kind of satellite view. So they can take a tour, because for some kids, they might not know what the corn region of Michigan looks like, or they might not know what the pine region of Michigan looks like, because especially if you live in a rural place, they might not experience these other places. So we've used Google Maps kind of in tandem with the clickable maps so that they could just have a real life view of what those places look like.
And do you now see clickable maps, all of the clickable maps, a menu up here? I'm
Yes,
waiting for you. Yep.
Yep.
Yep. So I should point out that there's a pretty nice clickable map of just the basic geography of the United States. And you can turn on the Mississippi watershed and see how that goes over here. Turn on baseball teams if you want for where they are. The state borders and the state names, make a quiz out of that. Now we've got an activity in Unit 2 that basically has people learn the state names for ones that are near here as they're looking at a trade network among the indigenous people. Because we're not really fond of these online quizzes where they show you the shape of the state and then you're supposed to put the name on it. It's like that's just a name attached to a shape. It's not a geography. You don't know where it is yet. But this one has got, a night NASA image. And you can see where Michigan is. You could see that line between the long growing season and the short growing season on the night map. Or you can look at the various indigenous peoples and see how the Potawatomi and the Ottawa, the Ojibwe, how they related to some of the others, because that will show up in the curriculum. So there's a US version of this. You can also go back over here and there's a North America one. And you can find Michigan in North America. And this will be important when we get to Unit 3, where we start talking about where the British forts were and where the French forts and then the French area was, things like that. So if you teach your students, like Lyndsey said, how to use these clickable maps, then they can have access to maps that show information about larger areas.
And Phil, I threw in the chat a comment that I just wanted to point out to everyone in case they can't see the chat. These are free. These are not anything that we charge for. We don't charge for any of this stuff. It's all open source because I have rolled out the clickable maps to teacher groups before. And I've had some people that are like, well, this is great, but our district probably can't afford them. Your district can afford them because it's free and it always will be. So just wanted to put that up there because people have asked.
People have asked, yeah. In fact, we've even talked about the fact that maybe we should charge for it because some people say, oh, if it's free, it can't be very good. These have won an award from the National Council for Geographic Education because they're a pretty powerful teaching aid. And there's a European colonies one that can be part of our discussion in the second one here. So with that, I'm going to close this out.
So before I share my PowerPoint, I just want to point out what the site looks like so that when you click on the link that Dave put in the chat, you kind of know what to expect. So when you get to the Giants site, it looks something like this. And then we're in third grade and the pacing view will kind of give you an overview of each unit. And then from here, you can also, you can go back and click into the units. So some feedback that we got from teachers is they just wanted some more information about how to plan around the Giants lessons because they are kind of lengthy on purpose. So I just want to point out what some of these are before we return to the slideshow. So your resource folder is going to hold all of the documents that you need for each unit, and then it's organized by lesson. When you open the resource folder, there are some important documents in here that I'm going to talk a little bit more about later. So that's one of the resources. And then your unit overview sheet is just going to tell you the story of the unit. It's got all of your learning targets here for each lesson, and then some other resources that you might need as you're kind of planning. And then your assessments for the unit will be linked near the bottom. You can also get to your instructional sequences from here if you need to as well. And then each lesson is linked on here, but you can also use the resource folder to get to each lesson. So I wanted just to give you some tips on how you might plan for your lessons, because as I said, the units are quite lengthy. So I wanted just to give you some tips and tricks that I've kind of come across in my work. So each unit overview sheet is going to have a link which will take you to the standards documents. So if you're interested in knowing how the lessons connect to the standards, you can click on this social studies content expectations and it will bring you to this document. I know for some teachers, they might need their standards posted, or they might need those for lesson plans. So that's where you can find those. And then I just want to point out some important planning documents within each folder. So the unit overview sheet we already looked at, and that just again tells you the story of the unit. And then within the broad third grade folder is a literature list that's going to tell you all of the read aloud books that you might want to look for in a library or think about purchasing. And it'll kind of designate which ones are really critical and which ones you could kind of get away with not using. And then in the big third grade folder, there's also this units at a glance sheet. And this tells you, this is kind of the pacing guide of all of the units. And it kind of gives you a layout of what activities you're going to do, because we recognize that some of you might have really limited time to teach social studies. And so you might have to make some decisions about which lessons you really want to do and which you might not have time for. So this will give you a broader view so that you can make those instructional choices. There's also a printable resource list. One piece of feedback we got from teachers is that it's a little bit cumbersome when they're teaching a lesson to have to kind of click and find out which things to print, which things might be PowerPoints. So we created this resource list for you that will just show you these are the things that you might need to print and make copies of. But this is not necessarily all of the resources for the lesson, just the things that you might need to think about ahead of time so that you can, get to the copy room and make those copies if you need to. There's also an assessment document, and you have the flexibility to use that in a way that makes sense for you. So all the assessments for each lesson are laid out there, and you might give the assessment for lesson 1 as kind of a formative assessment or a summative, or you might hold off and do all the assessments at the end of the unit. You can kind of use those assessments in a way that works best for you, but they're all laid out in that one assessment document, and they are labeled so you know which part goes with which lesson. So to plan a lesson, you really want to think through the lens of what's my compelling question and what's my supporting question. And then you really want to think about which components of the lesson are really going to help your students answer the supporting question to help them think more about the compelling question. So I put some questions up here that might help guide your thinking, but we really want to think about looking at the resource that is offered in each component of the lesson, and then thinking about how those components support your learning. So I'm going to go back to the actual Giants lesson. Can everybody see that, the lesson page?
Yes.
Okay. So this is the lesson page that Phil was using earlier. So as I'm planning, I'm just going to do kind of like a think aloud of what I might think as a teacher when I'm planning. So first I want to think about, okay, here are my learning targets. And I know that this fits into the second component. So I can scroll up to the top here. All right, my compelling question, what makes Michigan special? And then my supporting question, how are conditions different in different parts of Michigan? And I know that my students have limited experience in traveling around the state, so I might want to spend a little extra time here. So this lesson is all about making a map easier to read and describing ways Michigan can be divided into regions. So it looks like I've got a PowerPoint resource, and then I've got some map activities that I could do with my students. And these look pretty similar. So maybe I want to choose one that we might do together and one to save for later. It also looks like this lesson has a textbook resource. So I might consider how I could use that as I'm teaching. All right, so I'm thinking about making a map easier to read and dividing Michigan into regions. So now I'm just going to skim through the lesson, and I call this like a quick read because I'm really just trying to get an idea of how the lesson might go. So I'm going to skim through and I'm going to think about how these resources might build that understanding I want my kids to have. So as I'm skimming through, I'm noticing that there's a lot of language around how regions are formed and what a region is, and really making connections between a place or within a place. So I think what I might want to do is use this PowerPoint to kind of help guide that lesson. And then I might choose one map to use instead of using all of them. So in this way, like I'm not reading through everything all the time. I'm just doing a kind of a quick skim, and I'm thinking through the lens of what's my supporting question and what components of the lesson are going to help my students answer that question. I might also take a second to kind of look over like what are the pieces that students might be doing. And I might think about if there's a PowerPoint, I might think about using one of the maps that the students can kind of annotate as we're going through the PowerPoint. I'm just going to want to keep in mind that I want my students doing something every lesson. I don't want to be talking at them the whole time. And then I also put in at the bottom here to make sure that you pre-plan how you want to prompt or question students, because that's always kind of a sticky part for me. Sometimes I give them too much information and then have to kind of backtrack. So before I go on, does anyone have any questions just about that planning component? Because I know for teachers, that was one of the trickier parts. Okay, so I'm gonna keep going. Thanks, Kevin. All right. Whoops. All right, so as you're planning a lesson, there are a few resources that you are going to want to be mindful of. Whoops. So Phil talked a lot about the clickable maps, and that's a resource that you're going to use often, and you will probably find some really great creative ways to use that, or your students might. So if you come across a way to use the clickable maps resource that really works well for you, please share it with us so that we can share it with other teachers. So you're going to use the clickable maps resource often. And like I said, if you can get students invested in it and learning how to use it, that will help you in the long run. And then another tool that we have throughout all of the units is My Open Book, which is a free social studies textbook that we have linked in many of the units and in the lessons. And I'll be honest, My Open Book can be a little bit daunting when you first open it up, because it's a digital textbook, which takes a little bit of time to figure out how to use, and there's a lot of text. So I don't often just blanket assign my students pages to read. I might choose a section that we might read together, or they might partner read with. But one really awesome thing about My Open Book is that it is packed full of pictures and really cool graphics and interactives. So I would encourage you on the lesson lessons where you see that, to just go in and check out those interactives, because sometimes they really convey the message of the lesson better than like the teacher talk component. So don't make sure you really look into that every time that pops up in a lesson. Any questions about those two resources before we look ahead? Or Phil and Dave, anything you want to add?
With Open Book, there's a mechanism in there for when things go dead. There's a bug report. You can fill it out, your kids can fill it out. Usually I get better information when the adults fill it out, but those bug reports do go to an actual person. I am that actual person. I just cleaned one up today in the 7th grade book. So if you come across a link in Open Book that's dead, fill out that bug report. And when I know about it, I can usually fix it within, an hour if I'm not in the middle of presenting something. So that's how we keep the books operational and fresh. As people report the bugs, they come to me and I fix them. So just keep that in mind if you do go all in with Open Book with your kids this year. If you come across a link that isn't working, just let me know.
I also want to point out with my Open Book that there are some videos in there, and like I said, there's a lot of interactive content. So I know sometimes I have a tendency to kind of just get to the bare bones of the lesson, and I might forget about that. But when you're planning, if you have some extra time to kind of plan ahead, one thing that's worked really good for me in the past is I've just kind of browsed through the chapter and I've just noted interactives and sections that I know are really good and will really work well with my students. And so I just kind of front load looking through the book prior to getting to that part of the lesson. So as you're planning, that's something you might want to keep in mind.
And let me add one more sentence to what both of them were saying about bug fixes and additions. Is there is still room on the clickable map in terms of the software that's underneath it to add up to 4 or 5 more layers if you've got a particular topic that you think would be useful. We've already heard some suggestions from some other. In fact, there is a layer of mammoths and mastodons where these fossils for these animals were found in Michigan, because there are some interesting read-alongs about what it was like to be a woolly mammoth during the Ice Age here. So if you've got suggestions about clickable maps, they also get updated, every year or two. And well, the suggestions are welcome. Half of the layers that are on there are because teachers made suggestions.
And Phil brings up a really good point in general about feedback. If there's something that's working well or not working well, please reach out to us, and I'll drop my email in the chat in just a few minutes, but please reach out to us because we really welcome feedback. Joy and I were in the classroom and we implemented these, but that's only through the lens of our own classrooms. But we would love to hear how things are going in your classrooms or in your regions, especially as you kind of bring in those local connections. So please share with us your successes or challenges so that we can kind of incorporate that into any of our revisions. So just looking ahead to our next session, we just wanted to highlight a couple of things that will be coming up our next session. So as you're preparing for Unit 2, there's this really cool resource in Unit 2. It's kind of like a little booklet about this character, Alexander Henry. And this is one of the primary sources that we're going to study in Unit 2. And it's a really neat little book that's got some math connections in it. It's got some places where kids can take some notes and color. And there's also some map activities. And it's a really high quality resource. It's tricky to find primary sources for kids that are readable and appropriate. So this is one resource that you'll definitely want to think about printing. It's also available as an electronic version. And I haven't used the full electronic version myself, so I can't really speak to how effective it is, but I have used the printed student copy. And every year I always print these booklets. So that's something to keep in mind as you're planning ahead for your second unit. And then I wanted to share a little bit about the big map. So I was lucky enough to get this gigantic floor map from Phil, and we used it for a lot of different things. And while I know everyone does not have this huge map that they can kind of spread out and sprawl out on in their classrooms, there's lots of things you can do with even a desktop size map, or those maps that Phil was showing earlier. So we use some Legos and some other random things to just kind of mark some resources on the map. We've also used our floor map and our desk maps to kind of track, kind of follow Alexander Henry as he moves around the state through the seasons, which you'll do in unit 2. And then we used markers and sticky notes to highlight and mark regions on the map, to label the Great Lakes, and just to practice some geography skills. So if you're able to get some maps that your kids can use and interact with, they really love it. And it's probably the highlight of teaching social studies, is just being able to see students interact with maps in cool ways. So if you're able to get your hands on something like that, I would definitely recommend it.
And I'm holding up the 1.5 by 1.5 foot version of it on the screen. There's also a 2 by 2 version, a 3 by 3 version, a 4 by 4, 6 by 6, and 8 by 8. And I think, Lyndsey, you had a 10 by 10. And any one of these is cheaper than a wall map from one of the commercial publishers, because this basically is made by the kind of company that makes, the homecoming parade things that you see up and down the streets in little towns. So we've got these floor maps available or table maps in a variety of different sizes at a really fairly reasonable price compared to the pull down wall maps that you can buy.
So Phil, a couple of people asked in the chat where we can get them. What we might do is build, what we might do is just, do that pricing with the company that Phil usually does. And then if for some reason, we're able to get a better price in bulk, to be continued. We will get it priced out and have a little more info for you at the next network session about where you might be able to get one. In the meantime, I think Michigan Geographic Alliance has, don't they have the giant Michigan floor map, Phil, that can be checked out?
But that's 25 by 25 feet. So, I mean, you need a gymnasium or a big cafeteria for that one.
Gotcha. I forgot
but
about
that's
that.
That's a free traveling map.
Yeah.
Becky has got a couple of the 10 by 10s that are traveling in Western Michigan, and Shauna Hearn in Eastern Michigan in Macomb County. He and I were actually corresponding yesterday. He's going to order a packet of them that are traveling maps in his area. So these are fairly new as a technology, and like I say, they're priced by the square foot, so they're not terribly expensive, but they're not exactly free. And what Dave said is true, that 2 of them do not cost twice as much as one. They only, there's a very steep drop in price with the bulk orders. And we're trying to figure out a way to, we're looking even for a distributor, but to figure out a way to make these available if people would want to have them. If you're in the Kalamazoo area, I will be happy to loan you my 6 by 6 version. I think the Gullwood Lake people have already claimed to use that for part of the time. Whoops, I see a Kalamazoozer here. I think Jonah has one too.
We will get some pricing going and see if we can do an order and then we can ship or drive. I don't know which yet, but we'll have more info for you at the November meeting for sure.
Yeah, and unfortunately is partly petroleum based, so it's subject to the world market, the same supply chain disruptions and so on. On the other hand, I do enough business with the company, it's in northern Minnesota, that I get a pretty hefty discount from them whenever they're not real busy. Like right now, they're real busy because of homecoming things like that. Spring of the year, they do a lot of Easter stuff. political season, they do a whole lot of these lawn maps and lawn signs and things like that.
So as we wrap up, are there any burning questions about how to use Giants, how to get started with Giants? Any questions that you might want answered at this time?
Now, we know that that's partly just because it's September, because we know that we were not that comprehensive and thorough and accurate. So if you have questions that come up, like for me, the question would always come up about 4 hours from now. Um, feel free to email.
Lyndsey, one question that you might want to spend just a second on, not that I don't love getting out half an hour early and we won't tell the sketch police, but the assessment piece, the assessments for third grade, where do they find them? I know you sort of breezed through it at one point. Can you go back one more time and kind of show off, I'm going to pick and choose some of the activities I do for Unit 1, but let me take a look at the assessment. I want to, see how to use it. So would you be willing to go over that real quick?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just gonna go to the Giants website again, just so you can kind of see how I got there. My dog is sniffing around behind me, so if you hear any dog noises, that's my dog. So I would suggest just kind of starting in the resource folder, because this is going to have everything you need for the whole unit in this one folder. So if you go to the resource folder, then you can click on the assessments. And Unit 1 is a little unique because, we've got a few different assessments in here, just because Unit 1 kind of covers a lot of basic geography skills. And we really want to make sure that kids have those solid, because we're really doing most of the geography work for third grade and fourth grade. So we really emphasize a lot of geography across the units, but especially in Unit 1. So there are a couple different assessments for Unit 1. Whoops, this tab is hiding. So this document, Unit 1 assessments, this will have this has your assessment for lesson 1, and then what? I think this might be a mistake. That's okay. I'll fix that later. So this is a geography assessment that, so if you want to just have your students label the Great Lakes, this is an assessment you can use, or you could also just assess some basic geography skills with them on this. And then there's a writing question down here on the bottom. Here comes my dog. And then we've got a summative assessment that kind of asks students to kind of identify regions. And then this one has, again, some writing in it. And then this unit actually has a couple different prompts that you can choose from depending upon how in depth you get with some of the resources. And it also includes a rubric. But if you look across the units, the assessments will always be in this main folder, the main unit folder, and it'll always be called Grade 3, Unit 2, Unit 3 assessments. So that's where you'll find the assessments. And then they should also be linked at the end of each. What was that, Phil?
Oh, just saying exactly that. But at the end of every one of the individual units, there's an assessment section that's got the links duplicated. So you've got two different pathways to get to these assessments.
Yes. Does that answer your question, Dave? Did I give enough information? Okay.
Yes, no, I appreciate it. There are a group of teachers who will be here normally who aren't tonight from Otsego, and one of the primary drivers for them was they wanted to learn more about some of the assessment pieces that were in there. So I wanted to make sure when they're catching the video recap that that's in there. So.
Yeah, and I'll also add that the assessments are kind of ongoing. So we've been working on them. We worked on them over the summer, and I'm hoping to continue working on them this year. So there's some that definitely could use a little bit more, but just know that we're still trying to develop those. And if you have suggestions or things, parts of the activities that you've used for assessments, you can always reach out to us and we can kind of add that to the lesson language.
Particularly if you've got an assessment question that links to your part of the state. Let us know about that, and we'll try to put those on to say, people are in the UP. So the third picture that she showed was something that was suggested by somebody from up near Marquette. who said they wanted to have a picture that was clearly an upper peninsula picture of the mining area that they could link to the clickable maps then.
So gang, we really appreciate your time and attention tonight. And, added bonus, we get out a little bit early tonight. Again, I'll edit that part out for the sketch police at the end of all of this. But for those of you who signed up for this initially for the summer with the museum piece, we still want to do the museum piece. It's just we're looking at doing it potentially this summer as a trailer, as instead of a lead in to this. So we'll have more info on that going through, but with all the date changes and everything else, really appreciate everyone's time, attention, and patience. And I hope that as we continue through this, you guys will see it was worth the little bit of extra headache that we had getting it set up at the start of the year. And don't hesitate to reach out to any of us. You can reply all to that email I sent today. And it'll go to Phil, Lindsay, and I, because I BCC'd the rest of you on it. So if you have any questions for any of us, feel free to email us individually or as the whole group. We're here to help support you as you implement this year and as you dip your toes in the water. And these rollouts will really help you prepare for what you'll come across in the units. But just thanks to everyone, and we will see you in November. November 1st, I believe, is our next date. So same format. We'll send the agenda out a week before and the day of again, so you've got all that. So thank you guys, and we'll see you soon.